Prescott judge believed he could use a fine to silence Pam Bondi. He didn't think she would ruin his whole argument. In front of everyone, the Tampa courthouse, there had been plenty of court cases in Florida. However, on this specific morning, nobody could have anticipated the storm that would soon break out. As sharp as ever, Pam Bondi entered the thick wooden doors, one hand holding a briefcase, the other was fixing her blazer's lapel. She was present, for a hearing that ought to have been standard. She could debate it as she slept, while walking up to the defendant's table. Before the judge ever said a word, she could feel his gaze on her. Alan Prescott, a judge. A man renowned for his straightforward manner was looking away from her face, but at a point directly beneath her collarbone. In the courtroom, a plain gold cross changed, a silent silence, then in a voice as piercing as a blow from a gavel. Prescott leaned forward and cleared his throat. "I have to remind you, Miss Bondi, that my courtroom is not the appropriate location for religious artifacts." Pam hardly gave Your Honor a blink. "You have on a cross. That goes against the spaces. Neutrality. You risk being fined if you don't take it off." A whisper reverberated among the small number of attendees. The bail was moved uneasily, with a quick glance at the judge, the clerk. Then, returning to Pam, this wasn't the first instance. A judge had attempted to take charge of his courtroom. In a peculiar manner, yet it was the initial, had anyone considered hiring a lawyer? Over a necklace, Pam remained motionless. "I apologize, Honor. However, my cross is identical to a wedding band, or a locket containing a family photo." The face of Judge Prescott was still unreadable. "I don't see it that way," he groaned, as though the conversation was already wearing on them. "Either take it down or I'll have to charge you." For ignoring the neutrality of the courtroom for the first time in her professional life, Pam Bondi received a fine. Not due to wrongdoing or a procedural infraction, but for putting on some jewelry. The problem wasn't the fine. It was what it stood for. She left the cross in place. Rather, she covered her briefcase with her folded hands. Her cool demeanor indicated that she wasn't going to let this go. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I want to formally address this matter." Judge Prescott's eyebrows went up. "Yes, address it. I'm going to lodge an objection, and would like to make my case publicly." The judge looked at the wall clock and grinned. "I am certain that Miss Bondi, you know that a business dispute is the subject of this hearing, nor your personal complaints." Pam didn't recoil, and I know that there is no recess for the First Amendment. For personal viewpoints that caught his interest, he reclined in his seat. Little narrowing of the eyes. The fingertips of the court reporter lingered over her keyboard. The room was tense now, not as a result of a contract dispute, but because an experienced lawyer had recently contested the authority of a judge. Pam was aware that she was treading carefully in front of him, but there was no way to back down. "You're pursuing me because I'm wearing a cross. Let's legally dissect that, shall we?" The judge rubbed his temples and sighed. But before he could answer, Pam was reaching inside her briefcase already. She would not merely debate, she was going to ruin his whole idea. However, Judge Prescott was unaware of the extent of the hole. He had begun to look for himself. Pam took one piece of paper out of her briefcase, delicately setting it on the table before her. She moved slowly and deliberately at every turn. Each moment of quiet was yet another increase in the room's tension. Judge Prescott, on Ms. Bondi's side, theatrics are not something I have time for. Pam and I both didn't blink. "Your Honor, but I do possess has a solid grasp of constitutional law." With his fingers intertwined, the judge leaned forward, as though preparing for whatever was about to happen. "You're pursuing me because I'm wearing a cross, arguing that it is against the neutrality of the courtroom. However, tell me about Your Honor. On which legal precedents are you relying?" There was silence in the room. The fingertips of the court reporter lingered over the keys. Bailiff hardly moved in his chair. Judge Prescott exhaled deeply. "I have authority over this courtroom." "Ms. Bondi," Pam said, "it does. However, that power is subordinate to the Constitution." The paper in front of her was tapped, and in accordance with the First Amendment, expressions of personal religion are protected. particularly when it doesn't interfere with the process. The judge laughed. "You're a lawyer." Pam, who was not a law professor, grinned. However, it lacked warmth. "Then, shall we discuss case law?" She took out the Tinker Vish Des Moines paper, a significant case that proved that people retain their constitutional rights when they walk inside a government building, whether it's a courtroom or a classroom. Judge Prescott's jaw slightly tenses up. He was aware that everyone in the legal profession did. Pam continued. Barnett vs. West Virginia, State Board of Education. The Supreme Court decided in that forcing them to take away or conceal emblems of individual convictions violates their rights under the First Amendment. She now put the paper down. "Your Honor, do you want me to continue, or would you rather have that fine reconsidered?" The fingers of the judge tapped against his chair's armrest. He was aware that he was in a corner, but he refused to give in because of his pride. "This is not yet a religious argument. Bondi, Miss, why did you make it one?" Pam tilted her head. There were a few silent gasps in the courtroom. Judge Prescott's face sufficiently browned. Although he spoke sharply, his power was eroding. Pam bends forward. Voice steady and respectfully, "Your Honor, I'll cease as soon as I have a reasons for this fine under the law, since I haven't heard one yet." After a lengthy delay, the judge turned to face the clerk. "Mark the best pending review." Pam grinned. "I'll consider that a short-term triumph." However, she wasn't finished yet. The actual battle has only just begun. The face of Judge Prescott was still unreadable. However, there was no mistake. The way he moved about in his seat, he had anticipated silent compliance, not a serious constitutional dispute. The tense atmosphere in the courtroom had subsided. Pam felt that it was electric. All eyes were fixed on her, watching and waiting. In the sand, she had traced a line, and the judge now had two options: maintain his feeble defense and run the risk of embarrassment, or figure out how to go back without losing command. Prescott, however, didn't give up lightly. He started with Ms. Bondi. Courtroom norms are in place for a purpose, and his tone was measured. "If I permit one kind of individual expression, I give them all access to the door." Pam's mouth pushed shut. "You mean similar to the wedding bands that half of the lawyers here wear, or the lapel pins that public servants are permitted to wear?" Pam didn't stop until Prescott's jaw tightened. "Or let's discuss the time. You gave permission for a defense lawyer to wear a pink ribbon. To raise awareness of breast cancer, you didn't. Mind that throughout a trial." Among the onlookers, a few soft whispers emerged. Prescott gave them a fierce look. However, the harm had already been done. His selective enforcement had just been revealed by Pam. Pam crossed her arms and sat back. "Tell me about your honor, please." "Why is my cross the only thing covered by this rule?" Prescott curled his fingers around his desk's edge. He was confined, and it was visible to everyone in that courtroom. He had imposed an unspoken regulation due to personal prejudice, and it was now collapsing under him. For the first time following the start of the hearing, he had nothing to say. Pam did not have to boast. She simply allowed the quiet to last, long enough for everyone to comprehend the situation's truth. Then she struck the last blow. "If you maintain this, it's okay. I shall be submitting an appeal, Your Honor, prior to the ruling's ink drying, and when it occurs, I promise that this case will garner media attention." She gave that some thought. Finding a lady who wears a crossing by a sitting judge court, I'm sure the upper courts would be delighted to comment on that precedence. Prescott's nose widened. His pride and ego were engaged in a conflict with the cold. Pam didn't turn away from the harsh facts. The longer he delayed, the longer she let him to dwell with it. The more glaring his error became after what seemed like a lifetime. Eventually, he let out a quick exhale, and the fine was canceled. He whispered, and Pam grinned. "Thank you so much for the recognition." However, this was no longer just a fee. She had just given a very clear message. Prescott would remember it for a long time. However, the consequences were only getting started. According to the judge, the fine is canceled. Ought to have stopped it. But the courtroom was no longer solely a venue for legal disputes. It was a site and all those in attendance had just seen something they probably wouldn't forget. The reporter for the court hardly raised her head from her computer. However, she was aware that this transcript would spread. Outside this room, the clerk who had appeared uncomfortable at first, moment the penalty was declared, just looked at Pam for a moment. As though impressed, Judge Prescott moved around in his seat. He arranged his papers, as though he could literally remove the occasion. But Pam was wiser. This was something he couldn't ignore. The quiet was overwhelming. Pam calmly repositioned her jacket. The little gold cross is still there, precisely where it had been all along. She had prevailed, but now she had to confirm this was more than just a triumph for me. It has to have a deeper meaning. She turned to a middle-aged business entrepreneur as her client. Who was the real cause of this hearing? The man offered her a respectful nod that was hardly visible. His faith in her is just increasing. Pam realized that this was no longer solely about her. The response outside the courthouse was instantaneous. A journalist, someone who was reporting on a completely different case within the same structure, learned about what had just transpired. In an hour, the headline was published on a local news website. A judge from Florida tries to penalize a lawyer for wearing a cross, but things don't work out as expected. Pam's phone buzzed repeatedly, followed by coworkers, former classmates. From law school journalists, people were curious about what had recently transpired. However, Pam had no interest in media spin or headlines. She had a more expansive vision. Her next move extending this matter beyond a single courtroom altercation. She wasn't gullible. She was aware that situations like these have repercussions, whether or not it was her intention. This involved more than one judge. In a single lawyer no longer. This constituted a precedent challenge. Something wasn't stated yet, but it might very well be. Would other judges try anything comparable? Would lawyers experience pressure to leave their own emblems at home to prevent conflict? Would others be emboldened by this moment? To test the limits of impartiality in the courtroom and methods that went after individual convictions, Pam refused to allow that to occur. By that night, the narrative had already gained momentum. A prominent legal analyst on a news outlet that leans conservative mentioned it at a panel discussion. There were strong discussions on social media between the people who backed the judges' positions and anyone who witnessed Pam's disobedience. As a crucial defense of fundamental rights in her office, Pam sat, observing the conversation on her phone. A national news network producer had already contacted them to ask for an interview. She rubbed her temple and exhaled softly. She had fought for clients for years, maintaining her position in circumstances with significant stakes. However, this felt different. This has nothing to do with business conflicts. Regarding defenses for crimes, this was about individual liberties, and whether it was possible to remove them at the discretion of one judge. Judge Prescott, however, wasn't finished with her. She sensed it, even as she was leaving that day's courthouse. The way he used to gaze at her, dismissing the session with a boom of the gavel, he may have canceled the penalty. However, there had been something in his face, an implicit difficulty. Pam had no idea what shape it would take. However, she was aware that the fight was far from finished. Pam had anticipated certain repercussions. A few emails, perhaps a few phone conversations from coworkers who weigh in. What she didn't anticipate was how quickly everything got out of hand. By the time she arrived at work the following morning, her helper Lauren was already waiting, looking worried. She said, "You must see this." Pam accepted her medication as she held it up. Looking at the screen just now, the Florida Bar Association released a statement. Impartial in tone and thoughtfully crafted, yet its consequences are clear. Judges are entitled to uphold decorum within their courts, whereas lawyers have the freedom to speak themselves. Respecting the roles is crucial. Established by the presiding judges, we rely on our legal system to handle these issues. With impartiality and honesty, Pam breathed out slowly. This was more than just a remark. The remark served as a warning. Observe the guidelines established by the presiding judges weren't merely a broad assertion. It was an indication that the legal community was close-knit. Courtroom conflicts were rarely discussed by the Florida Bar. Unless they had good cause to think a situation was becoming unmanageable, Prescott was therefore more than just resentful. He had already begun working in the background. To mobilize institutional support, she put down the tablet which was released today. An hour ago, Lauren nodded. The modest size of the legal community did not surprise Pam. Word had spread quickly. Prescott was obviously not taking this lightly, but before she could speak again, Lauren paused. "There's more." Pam looked up as she stated that thoughtfully. Her face was unreadable. "Proceed." Lauren gave her another piece of paper. The first few lines of this one were printed by Pam Skim. Her mind was racing, yet her pulse was still. Pamela Bondi, an attorney. The way she carried herself was such that interrupted the court's proceedings, improperly contest judicial authority, and took part in actions. Inappropriate behavior for a court official. Pam couldn't resist letting out. A little laugh that lacks humor is inappropriate. "That's rich," she said, shaking her head. "According to Lauren, it's retaliation." Pam leans back in her chair, pure and uncomplicated. She tapped the armrest with her fingers. Prescott had more in mind than retaliation. His goal was to lead by example. In his own courtroom he had lost, and he was now reclaiming his authority through the system. By submitting this official grievance, he was attempting to change the story. The judge was no longer him. He went above his authority. His portrayal of himself as the one who had been treated disrespectfully. Along with Pam, he aimed to portray her as the careless lawyer who had contested him. For the sole purpose of opposing him, Pam had already witnessed this move. It was a typical strategy. Transformation of the accuser into the accused changed the narrative, so the actual problem was obscured by bureaucracy. And details, however, she wasn't going to allow it to occur. "How does this method work?" she asked, already changing course. Lauren lets out a breath. "You'll have 10 days to reply. If the complaint proceeds, they might carry out an official review." Pam gave a slow nod. "And who is in charge of that review?" Lauren paused. "A group including top lawyers and judges." Pam nearly grinned. If Prescott intended to bury her in documents and silent pressure, which he had misjudged because this could not be done in a peaceful manner, this was going to be widely known. Lauren observed her while awaiting her response. "Pam, what would you like to do?" She inhaled deeply, then grabbed her phone. Prescott's desire to play games. "Come on, let's play." She looked over her contacts. Her thoughts are already 10 steps ahead. Prescott believed she would defend herself in a hearing held behind closed doors, aside from a gentle admonition, and move on. However, he had no idea who he was interacting with. Pam had always played the long game in her job, and she was going to ensure that everyone was observing. Pam wasted no time in understanding how these gadgets operated. Retaliation worked best when it took place. Prescott wanted to deal with things quietly in the shadows, utilizing the system against her while keeping the general populace unaware. She had no intention of allowing that to occur. She browsed through her mobile device, located the contact she required, and hit the call button. After 2 rings, a recognizable voice responded. "I was going to give you a call, Pam." It was seasoned journalist Lisa Reynolds. From a program on national legal affairs, she has previously covered some of Pam's most significant cases, and more crucially, she pursued judicial excess without fear. Pam came right to the point. "Lisa, please pay close attention. I recently received a formal complaint from a court for interfering with court proceedings. But what actually took place? He looked for me since I had a cross on, and when I refused to back down, he gave in. However, he is now punishing me through the system." Lisa remained quiet for a while. Then she exhaled sharply. "You're telling me a current judge is attempting to punish you because you exposed his misuse of authority?" "That's just what I'm telling you," Pam grinned. Without hesitation, Lisa said, "I'm running this, Pam. Bend forward. I need it documented before they attempt to fabricate it. After it becomes public, this cannot be turned into a tranquil situation by Prescott." Lisa was already working on the disciplinary matter. "By tomorrow, I'll have a segment up. and I'll ensure that legal analysts provide their opinions, particularly those who won't hesitate to call this out. Pam hung up for what it was, detecting the initial signs of momentum changing to her advantage, but she wasn't finished yet. She looked back at Lauren. Create a statement for the public. I want to be clear about where I stand. Before attempting to muddle the waters with Prescott and his friends, Lauren gave a nod. You want to portray this as an overreach by the judiciary? Pam shook her head. I would like to present it as it is. An assault on individual liberties and a misuse of the court's authority. Should this judge believe that he can punish me for defending myself, consider the damage he has caused to others, who are without a platform. Lauren's face became stern. Pam, I'll finish it. Exhale, assembling her thoughts. Silence was what Prescott had been depending on. However, the nation was about to learn. Just what he had done, Pam's waiting time was short. When she finally settled down with her coffee, her phone started vibrating constantly the following morning. The Lisa Reynolds section had been picked up by news outlets, and social media was in flames overnight. The headline was widely circulated. Judge in Florida tries to discipline a lawyer for wearing a cross. He's being criticized now. The story wasn't only carried by conservative media. All legal analysts are on the left. They were weighing in right and center. A Georgetown constitutional attorney went on live TV to dissect Prescott's reasoning. Phoning it an obvious excess with no legal basis, another well-known lawyer started a topic, analyzing how Pam's behavior had revealed a risky precedent. Item required attention, and last, Pam received the statement she had been anticipating. The Judicial Review Board of Florida declared that because of the publicity they would be examining the actions of Judge Prescott. To ascertain if his decision had breached judicial ethics, Pam reclines in her chair and lets out a breath. It wasn't just about her anymore. This applied to all lawyers, each defendant, all those who had ever entered a courtroom questioning if their rights could be taken away. Using a judge's pen stroke, Lauren entered with her phone in her hand. You will want to watch this. Pam took it and hit the play button. He was outside the courtroom, and it was Prescott. He was surrounded by flashing cameras. His facial movements were rigid, and the statement was brief. Too short for someone attempting self-defense. I have consistently maintained this courtroom's integrity. The measures implemented were motivated by the desire to remain impartial. Nonetheless, I value the judicial review procedure and will comply completely. Pam nearly chuckled, indifferently. He continued to attempt to play that card. Lauren crossed her arms in an attempt to maintain her dignity. Pam nodded, but this wasn't going away, so she failed. The Judicial Review Board needed to make a choice. If they choose not to support Prescott, it would be more than simply a humiliation for your career. It would establish a standard that protected individuals such as Pam from ever having to deal with this kind of reprisal again. Nevertheless, even if they didn't formally censure him, where it counted most, he had already lost. His reliability and reputation, his power since following this, every lawyer who entered his courtroom would be aware if the judge attempted to quiet someone. And forlorn Pam sipped her coffee slowly, immediately turned to face Lauren. We had won. Oh, Lauren Smarta, I am aware that Pam put down her cup. She had not just stood up for herself. She had warned against letting someone in a position of authority deprive you of your rights without resistance, because sometimes one person is all that is needed. Refusing to back down in order to alter everything, if you think it's important, to defend your rights, ensure that your voice is heard. Similar to For more important real stories, leave a comment and subscribe.